Hi guys, so if we have a particular chord progression, say A minor 7 going to D7, going to half a bar of D minor 7 followed by G7, and then finally resolving to a bar of C major 7, so that sounds something like this. Then we can do a number of things to make this chord progression a little bit more interesting, if the melody permits, of course. So firstly, we can anticipate some chords by playing them a little bit earlier than they should be. So or we can delay some chords by playing them a little bit later than we should. Or we can omit chords. Or we can add more chords. Or we can substitute the existing chords for other chords. Or we can superimpose a brand new chord progression, so do a kind of reharmonization. Right, so in that case I was just using 2 5s, but you could conceivably use any other kind of reharmonization, whether it's Coltrane changes or 5 1s or sort of bluesy 5 4 1s or pedal points or whatever. Just getting rid of the original chord progression and coming up with your own chords, your own reharmonization. Now, when improvising, there's no reason you can't do the exact same things with a melody line. That is, play a melody that outlines or suggests a different chord progression to the one that's actually written out, even while the rhythm section or your left hand is playing the original chord progression. Now, the easiest way to do this is by using arpeggios, because it really spells out each individual chord. But you can also do this using the relevant chord scales. So for example, if we keep that same chord progression, A minor 7 to D7 to D minor 7, G7 to C major 7, then we could play an improvisation over that chord progression that anticipates some of those chord changes. Right, so in my little solo, I played an F sharp over the A minor 7 chord, which kind of anticipates the next D7 chord, being the third of D7. And at the end, I also reached the note C a little bit too early, while I was still on the G7 chord. So my solo or improvisation was anticipating some of the chord changes. Similarly, you could do the same thing, but delaying your improvisation to sort of follow or lag the chord changes. Right, so I was still playing the A minor 7 arpeggio, even though I had moved over to the D7 chord. And I was still playing the G7 arpeggio over the C major 7 chord before finally resolving it to the C. Or again, you can omit a particular chord from your improvisation and just pretend it's not there and just play over the top of it. Right, so in that little improvisation, I did not make any kind of references to the D7 chord. I didn't play the F sharp, I didn't really emphasize the C, the 7th. It was as if I was improvising over 2 bars of A minor 7. Or again, you can add more chords to your improvisation, even though they're not actually being played. Right, so there, even though I was only playing an A minor 7 chord, in my improvisation I arpeggiated an A minor chord, followed by an A7 chord. And similarly, while I was playing the D7 chord, I arpeggiated a D7, followed by an E flat 7. Which I suppose is a kind of side slipping, if you like. And so I was improvising as if there were more chords than there actually were. I sort of played a few phantom chords in my improvisation. Or again, similarly, you can outline a substitute chord, even though the chord being played in your left hand or in the rhythm section is the original chord. So for example, right, so there, even though I was playing a D7 in my left hand, I was outlining the tritone substitution in my improvisation, the A flat 7. And similarly, even though I was playing a G7 in my left hand, I was outlining the tritone substitution in my right hand, so the D flat 7. And finally, you can play or imply a whole different unrelated chord progression in your improvisation than what's actually being played in your left hand. So in a sense then, you're superimposing a brand new chord progression over an existing chord progression. Right, so that time, even though I was playing an A minor 7 in my left hand, I was arpeggiating or implying an F sharp half diminished, followed by a B7 in my right hand in my solo. Then over the D7, I implied an E minor 7, followed by an A7. So then as far as my right hand or my solo was concerned, I was playing over a series of descending 2/5s, finishing on the tonic. Or again, you could do something like this. Right, so superimposing a chord progression that's being implied in your solo over a completely different unrelated chord progression that's actually being played in your left hand or in the rhythm section is quite conceptually simple, but can sound quite interesting and quite complex, even though you're doing something as simple as arpeggiating a different chord progression. Now, this idea of superimposing a chord progression in your solo is a widely used technique in jazz. Now, using the idea of anticipating or delaying a particular chord in your improvisation has been used more or less since the beginning of jazz, and especially during the bebop era. But superimposing a whole new chord progression or a brand new chord over an existing chord progression is used in more modernist and contemporary jazz, and certainly in more avant-garde or free jazz contexts. So by people like Lenny Tristano and John Coltrane. Both of them really like to use this idea of superimposing new chords over an existing chord. And so you're almost literally completely disregarding the actual chord progression and just soloing over your own made-up chord progression instead, so that you're playing a different chord progression to everybody else, or to your left hand. And it doesn't really matter what new chord progression you create. It can be as simple or as complex as you like. And as I just said, this is a really simple idea which can make your solo sound quite interesting and complex. And it really creates a kind of polytonality. So that while the chord progression is implying one particular tonic chord, you could be playing a set of arpeggios or scales or licks that implies a different tonic chord. Right, so my left hand was playing a 2-5-1 in C, implying C as the tonic chord, and my right hand was arpeggiating a 2-5-1 in F, implying the F as the tonic chord. Now, there are nevertheless some guidelines when superimposing a new chord progression in your solo over an existing one. Now, these guidelines can be broken, so they're exactly that, they're just guidelines, but you can just sort of stick to them to begin with to make your superimposition sound good and strong before then experimenting by breaking them and seeing what else you can create. So firstly, superimposing a new chord progression works better if it's structurally strong. Now essentially all that means is that it's well known, widely used, and is functional and cadential, that it's kind of implying a tonic chord and implying some kind of finality, like a 2-5 or like a 5-1 or like a 5-4-1 in a blues. So that even though your superimposed chord progression clashes with the underlying harmony, that is the chords that you're playing, because it's structurally strong, because you're still playing, for example, 2 5s, even though they're in the wrong key, it still sounds good precisely because it's structured. So like the example I just gave, playing a 2-5-1 in C in the chords, but superimposing a 2-5-1 in F in your solo. So then even though we're playing in the wrong key, it still sounds okay because we're superimposing one 2-5-1 over another 2-5-1. So we're kind of layering 2-5-1s on top of each other. So they still sound quite sort of structured and logical and make some kind of sense and therefore sound good. Now secondly, you still want to adhere to the principle of tension and release. So then if you're superimposing two closely related keys in the circle of fifths, like a 2-5-1 in F over a 2-5-1 in C, then it doesn't create that much tension because it shares a lot of common notes in the chords and in the scales. Whereas if you're superimposing two unrelated keys, like a 2-5-1 in C with a 2-5-1 in G flat, that's going to create a lot of tension that's going to feel like it wants to resolve somewhere. And the more closely two scales are related, the more common tones each of the chords will share. So for example, D minor 7 and G minor 7 share two notes that are the same, and G7 and C7 share one note that's the same. So that makes them slightly less dissonant when superimposed over each other. Right, so it's just like all jazz improvisation. You still want to build some tension and then resolve some tension. And because you're playing in polytonality, the more unrelated the two scales or chord progressions are, the more tension it's going to create, because it's going to sort of sound like you're playing wrong notes. And that tension's going to feel like it's going to want to resolve to, say, a guide tone in the chord C. Or whatever. Now this also works better if you create nice melodic phrases that are relatively smooth, so using either steps or arpeggios like I was using, and not using too many sort of big leaps or tritones. That's going to sound a little bit stranger and you're going to kind of lose this technique because you're no longer obviously outlining a new chord progression over an existing one. Now this also works better if it's balanced. Now by balanced, I mean as you increase the emphasis or the complexity of one element, you decrease the emphasis and complexity of all the other elements. So that if you're playing something harmonically complex, like a harmonically complex superimposition of one chord over another, you want to use a relatively simple melody, so just using arpeggios of the 7th chord like I was using, rather than sort of the higher tensions and alterations and avoid notes that'll sort of lose that simplicity and that obvious chord superimposition. And use a relatively simple rhythm, so I was just using 8th notes rather than using like really heavy syncopation. So like I said, this is to create a little bit of balance in your composition or your improvisation. Right, if all of your elements in your music are too complex and too heavy and too dense, it can sound a little bit chaotic and a little bit sort of distracting, like you don't really know what you're supposed to be listening to. So generally, you only want to emphasize or complicate one element at a time. just so you don't overload the listener and the listener sort of listens to one interesting element at a time, to maintain that kind of balance. And the final thing I should say was that you can also superimpose scales rather than arpeggios. So again, taking my earlier example, if we have a 2-5-1 in C in the chord progression, and we want to play a 2-5-1 in F in the solo, then instead of playing arpeggios, I could play the actual chord scale that relates to each of those chords. So play G Dorian, followed by C Mixolydian, followed by F Ionian. Right, so that's perfectly fine. Those scales still imply that particular 2-5-1 chord progression in F. I was just using arpeggios to really sort of drive home this point and to make it really easy and plain to see what I was doing. Cool, and that's it for me guys. Thanks a lot for watching and see ya.